The trick is to realize that we can't stop emotional feelings from arising within us. And for that matter, we can't stop thoughts from happening in response to the situations. But what we can do is reserve a certain amount of time and energy each time a difficult emotion comes up to develop a skillful relationship to those thoughts and feelings. Now, this can take two forms. We can either do it on the hoof, so to speak, while the thoughts and feelings are coming up, while we're responding to life situations. If we really have good skills, we can be working with those thoughts and feelings at the same time, just like you can drive the car and do something else at the same time. However, at the beginning, that is likely to be very difficult. So what we usually need to do in the early part of our training is just sit silently for a period of time and sit with the intention not to figure out what's going on, not to figure out what to do about it. We can do that at other times, but we decide to reserve a period of time, maybe 10 minutes, maybe an hour, maybe half a day. And we say, for this period of time, I'm not going to be concerned with figuring out what's going on. I'm not going to be concerned with figuring out what to do, but rather I am going to cultivate the ability to have a complete experience of these thoughts and feelings. When we have a complete experience of the thoughts and feelings, we don't identify with the thoughts and feelings. They flow through us, but they're experienced not as a self, but as a releasing of spiritual blockages. So a complete experience of a difficult emotion is a true catharsis in the Greek sense of the word catharsis, which means a cleaning out. Now, usually people interpret catharsis to mean a complete external expression. If you make a complete external expression, if you are willing to really cry or really scream or really express yourself or really take appropriate action, that's catharsis. And a therapy that teaches you how to do that is cathartic therapy. But that's external expression. That in and of itself does not constitute permanent cleansing of consciousness. Unless there is an infusing of the thoughts and feelings with mindfulness, equanimity, and a cognizance of their impermanent nature, then no matter how dramatic our external display may be, it won't achieve very much in terms of permanent change. It won't get us any closer to experiencing our spiritual source in the midst of these difficult emotions. Most people affirm some sort of spiritual value, but as soon as there's even a little bit of anger, fear, sadness, embarrassment, frustration, it just goes away. It just vanishes. And it doesn't have to. In fact, the anger, fear, sadness, etc., represent one of the best possible opportunities to really cleanse consciousness, which culminates in the ability to experience those difficult emotions as none other than the effortless flow of nature. So, what do I mean by mindfulness? When I described the subjective flow of thought and feeling that constitutes the difficult emotion, in the example that I gave, I described it in tremendous detail. I talked about what's happening in the body in terms of qualities of sensation and their spatial distribution in the body. I talked about what's happening in the mind in terms of the types of thoughts that come up. Mindfulness means the ability to keep track of all of the components that constitute an experience while that experience is happening. Now, of course, mindfulness is one of these skills that has to be developed with practice so that you can keep track of all of these components and also do other things at the same time. As I say at the beginning, you may have to just go off by yourself in order to practice and develop the mindfulness. Eventually, you have a baseline of mindfulness. It allows you to keep specific contact with the components that constitute an experience. Equanimity means a non-interference with the natural movement of those components. The sadness flavor in the throat may shift and change moment by moment, get stronger, get weaker, spread, yank in. Your willingness to let it do that, to let it last as long or as short as it needs to, is equanimity. Likewise with each of the other flavors, and also with the thinking process. Your willingness to allow the thoughts to speed up or slow down, to allow the associational field of thought to spread or collapse, to allow the inner voice to get louder or softer without interference, is equanimity. Your ability to look through the mental images rather than at them, to listen to the internal voice as though it were just sound, rather than getting caught up moment by moment in its meanings. That's equanimity. And as one infuses mindfulness and equanimity into the thoughts and feelings that constitute the emotion, those thoughts and feelings begin to flow more easily. And that encourages one to infuse even more mindfulness and equanimity, and it sets up a kind of positive feedback loop, or we might even describe it as a virtuous cycle as opposed to a vicious cycle. In the virtuous cycle, we infuse mindfulness and equanimity, the experience becomes more fluid. That encourages us to infuse even more mindfulness and equanimity, and the experience becomes even more fluid as the result of that. At some point, even though the experience may be confusing to the mind and painful to the body, the confusion becomes fluid, and the discomfort, the uncomfortable flavors of anger, fear, sadness also become fluid. Ice and water are the same substance, but their behavior is very, very different. In the same way, anger, fear, and sadness could either be congealed, in which case they cause tremendous suffering, or they can be fluid, in which case they cause much less suffering and are rather experienced as a kind of releasing process. So when people talk about releasing painful emotions, as I say, they usually are implying some sort of full external expression of the painful emotion. But from a spiritual point of view, a release has to be something permanent, not a temporary blowing off of steam. And the real release takes place when you have so fully infused the flow of thoughts and feelings that you really see that it is a flow. And it seems like something is being taken away from you moment by moment. And what's being taken away from you are the thorns that have been embedded in the substance of your soul. And you experience this negative emotion as an internal cleansing. When you are able to do that, you may or may not externally express, depending on what? Depending on what's appropriate to the situation. In some situations, it's appropriate to give full, unblocked external expression. In other situations, it's not appropriate. But whenever there's an unblocked internal expression of feeling, that is to say, whenever you are in contact with the thoughts and feelings with mindfulness, equanimity, and you're aware of their impermanence, their moment-by-moment changing qualities. Whenever that happens, you are by definition having a complete internal expression. And that is always desirable. You can do an experiment for yourself to understand the nature of the emotions and the relationship of mindfulness to the emotions. If you know that you're going to encounter a challenging situation ahead of time, you're going to go into some situation where you may have some anger, some fear, some sadness, something come up, but it hasn't come up yet. You can do the following. Bring your awareness into your body and be aware of the different kinds of sensations that are there, and see if you have any sensations that you would suspect are associated with the emotions that may come up. There may be no such sensations, or there may be already the buds of these qualities. Then, as you move into the challenging situation, watch what happens to the body sensations. See if you can keep track of them. I had an interesting experience once doing this experiment. I was riding down the street and I noticed that in an empty lot near where I lived, they were running a carnival. And this is like a local barrio carnival. It's, not like a real high-tech type situation. And one always wonders how the safety is in these kinds of situations. But they had this like giant thing that was sort of like a Ferris wheel, except instead of having the usual seats that you sit in a Ferris wheel, this had these bullet-shaped encased structures that hung and swung around. So that when they ran this Ferris wheel type thing, what happened is that you had two circular motions taking place, the large motion of the wheel and the small motion of each cage swinging around the perimeter of the wheel, giving an extremely disorienting perception, basically the perception being that you have just become disconnected, that the thing is broken apart and you're flying off into space at any given second. That's what your body is convinced is happening. So I thought, wow, this would be an interesting ride to play with, to explore the fear phenomenon. So what happens is that I first decide, okay, I'm going to do that. And I feel a little bit of just a very vague sort of pressure over my body, almost nothing, almost just so wispy that you're not even sure it's there at the initial decision to do this. Then, as I'm driving my car, getting closer and closer, I notice that a little more structure is appearing. It's all the fear flavor, but different aspects of the fear flavor are appearing in my abdomen, and then something in my arms, something in my head. And then as I arrive there and purchase the ticket to get on the ride, now I'm aware of about half dozen different locations acting up. Each one is changing in intensity with time, some changing rapidly, some changing slowly. And I'm also aware of how each one is spreading an influence through the body. Okay, so far so good. Now I get into the car, right? And the sensations are getting like much more intense, changing much more rapidly. In this particular case, it was all in the body. I didn't have any thoughts at all. It was all in the body, but they're getting much more rapid, much more intense, many more of them. But I'm keeping track of it all. Okay, no problem. And then the ride starts and I freak out. Suddenly, I am really scared and my mind is acting up. I just want to get the hell out of there and turn my awareness to my body. I can't feel anything. Well, I know damn well it's just full of sensations. But I've lost all my resolution power, all my contact. Took me about 5 minutes of self-talk. Get back and feel the body. You know it's there. It was getting more and more of it and more intense. That sequence has to have culminated not in it disappearing, but in it becoming so much that you lost track of it. So get back, okay, feel what's in your gut, what's in your knee, what's in your head, what's here, what's there. After 5-10 minutes of talking to myself, once again, I can feel the body. And I start to feel a lot better. And then as soon as I establish contact with everything that was there, which was much more intense than before, but now I got it all in awareness, and I'm letting it expand and contract and vibrate and pull in and push out. No more suffering, no more freak out. Everything's just fine now. What does this experiment reveal? Well, I had mindfulness, then suddenly I freaked out and I didn't have mindfulness. And you can do this experiment over and over again in daily life, and you'll find that whenever you, quote, freak out, by freak out I mean either suffer or act inappropriately, have distorted behavior, that just before you freak out, there is a dramatic drop in your mindfulness. Always. This is an empirical truth. Just before you lose it, just before you suffer, you lose contact with what is. And as I say, you can try this as an experiment if you know that you're going to go into a challenging situation. And if you do it over and over again, a certain empirical truth means an experimental truth, a scientific truth, will become evident to you. There are laws of nature, the laws of gravitation. It's a law. Well, there's a certain law in our human nature, and it is that suffering implies that you have lost mindfulness. Now, the implication of this is if you don't lose mindfulness, you won't suffer. It's dramatic. You're okay, you're in contact, you're okay. Suddenly you're not okay. And you look at, you're not in contact, you've lost the contact. So the contrapositive of that statement that suffering implies loss of mindfulness is no loss of mindfulness implies no suffering. That's a logical conclusion. And combined with the other empirical fact that mindfulness can be cultivated to any degree desirable. In other words, with practice, you can have mindfulness that can survive any complexity and intensity of emotion. So these two facts taken together mean that no one ever really has to suffer because of emotions. So this is what mindfulness is, keeping contact with the components. In terms of specifically how to develop what we might call skill at feeling or emotional IQ, as it is nowadays called, a good place to start is with the body sensations. When we say the word emotion in English, most people have a very vague sense of what emotion means. First of all, they confuse the external expression of emotion with the internal experience of emotion. So emotion is the sounds you make, the facial gestures, what you do, that's emotion to some people. That's objective, that's on the outside. But emotion is also what you feel and what you think. That's on the inside. So people are confused. For me, when I use the word emotion, I refer only to the subjective side of the experience. The subjective side is thought and feeling. People confuse thought and feeling. When a person says, I'm going to share my feelings with you, do they mean that they're going to say a sad flavor in the throat spreading over the rest of the body, a shaky quality in my knees spreading over the rest of my body, a tightness in the back of my neck? That would be to share their feelings. No, they're going to say, this is what's wrong with you, this is why I'm pissed off with you, and this is what has to change about you. Those aren't their feelings. Those are their thoughts. Their ideas, their concepts, their judgments, their plans, their fantasies. Because the thought and feeling is tangled together, and because people don't have the mindfulness to discriminate in real time, moment by moment, what part of the emotion is thought, what part is feeling, they're happening in parallel. People don't discriminate them. So naturally they get confused. They call feeling thought and thought feeling. Feeling is pleasant or unpleasant sensation in the body. Babies have feeling. Babies experience anger, fear, sadness. Animals experience anger, fear, sadness without a whole lot of internal dialogue or even internal imagery going on in their mind. They have just the pure feeling. And you could see, look at a dog when it's happy, okay? It's happy right down to its wagging tail. Its whole body is happy. Look at a baby when it's upset. Its whole body is involved. It shakes every single part of its body. It feels in the body, and so does an adult feel in the body. The problem is they're so fixated on the moment-by-moment thinking process, which forms the core of the adult ego, that there's very little discernment, very little discrimination in the body. And discrimination of what? Basically, the feeling in the body has several dimensions to it. There is a dimension of what, for lack of a better word, I would call quality or flavor. Anger feels different from sadness. Sadness feels different from fear. Fear feels different from hot. Hot feels different from cold. Cold feels different from erotic. Erotic feels different from embarrassment. Embarrassment feels different from itch. Itch feels different from prick. Prick feels different from pressure. These are different qualities of sensation. Then there is the spatial distribution. Typically, a sensation in the body will have one or several areas where it's strong, and then it will subtly spread a similar quality throughout much or all of the body. And that subtle global coloration that spreads from the local intensities is usually missed by people. But if it's missed, then it will be congealed and it will become a source of great suffering. So one needs to be aware of the different flavors that are present, the different qualities of sensation. I had a student once that died of cancer, and I guided him, and it was pretty straightforward. I noticed that he had 5 qualities of sensation. They were all distinct. He had a kind of pain from the tumors. He had exhaustion from not being able to sleep. He had nausea. He had fear. And he had a little bit of irritability. 5 flavors of sensation. Each one had its own local intent area of impact. Each one filled his whole body subtly. I told him, this is what's going on from what I can see talking to you. Does that agree with what's going on? He said, yeah, come to think of it, you gave me an exact description of what's going on. I said, okay, you got to keep track of each one of those 5. Sometimes only 1 or 2 will be present. Sometimes maybe all 5 will be present. Keep track of the qualities as being absolutely distinct and only deal with what is actually there in the moment. Be aware of where the primaries are. Be aware of how the secondary may spread. And give permission for those sensations to get stronger or weaker. So the first dimension is quality. The second dimension is its spatial distribution, because its shape and its location can differ. And a third dimension is its intensity. Fear is a quality, but that quality can be very mild, like a subtle anticipation, or it can be very intense, paralytic terror. But it's still the same quality, just different intensity. So if one is aware of the qualities, the locations and shapes, and the intensity, then one starts to notice that the qualities, intensities, and shapes and locations change. And one can then start to open up to that change. And the more one opens up to that change, the more the change takes place. And at some point, a certain critical momentum is built up. And the entire gestalt becomes like a wave, just part of the effortless flow of nature. At that point, you're having real catharsis. But at that point, you've lost any sense of a controlling self for a short period of time. You have to be willing to let that happen. For real catharsis, we can't hold on. Now that sounds frightening, the sense of a loss of control. However, when one surrenders to the primordial flow of impermanence, one finds that all impermanence is made up of expanding and contracting forces that vibrate, sometimes just expanding, sometimes just contracting, sometimes vibrating in between. And this rhythm of expansion and contraction and vibration becomes a kind of ordering principle that we rest in, a primordial ordering principle that is so deep, so fundamental that it can never be disordered, even though your mind may be full of confusion and your body full of pain. Because the confusion becomes an expansion and contraction, like the flow of the seasons is an expansion and contraction. And the pain becomes an expansion and contraction, like the vibration of atoms, which is part of the order of the universe. And so one rests in the shaking itself. We talk about being blown away. We talk about being crushed. We talk about being shaken to the core. It's a very good description of what emotion, being set into motion, is supposed to really be. Emotion is supposed to be pure motion. When we're in a state of pure motion, then the blowaway is just expanding out and becoming infinitely large and encompassing the whole universe. The crush is just contracting down and becoming the belly button of the universe, the dimensionless point out of which everything comes. And the shaking is just the flow of spirit itself. It's like the leaves that shake because the wind blows through. In the Hebrew language, wind is called ruach, and that's what they translated into English as spirit. It's just a wind blowing through at that point, and it's a cleansing wind. So that's called yielding to the primordial forces of impermanence. That's called a complete experience of the emotion. So a place to start for most people is to make the feeling tangible by keeping track of the flavors, locations, intensities, shapes, and then noticing how they change, and then yielding to that change. So one can start in the body. And in fact, the whole job can be completed in the body. Some people never really get into the thinking part of the emotion. If you can complete it just in the body, that's good enough. Sometimes when you go through an emotion, there'll just be one flavor present, one quality, maybe anger, maybe fear. But often, if you look carefully, you'll find that subtly several qualities are present. You may say, I'm primarily experiencing anger now, but look carefully. You might find there's some hurt there, simultaneously present. So the ability to tease out the qualities of sensation and then make them precise in terms of location, shape, intensity, this is an important first step in the process of making the feeling part of the emotion, the body sensations, tangible.